The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of white lilies and slow-braised lamb, a fragrance that felt like the physical weight of 10 years of marriage. I had spent 4 hours in the kitchen, my hands stained with herbs and my heart racing with a quiet, desperate hope. Today was the day David was supposed to become executive vice president, and I had curated every inch of our Denver townhome to reflect his success. The vintage champagne was sweating in a silver bucket, and I was wearing an emerald silk dress he'd once admired on a stranger in a magazine. I sat at the head of the table, the ivory candles flickering like tiny beacons, waiting for the man I had spent a decade fixing to finally come home and see me. My name is May. I'm 37 years old, and for a long time I believed that if I made myself small enough, I could make David feel like a giant. While he climbed the corporate ladder at his firm, smelling of cedarwood and expensive ambition, I worked as a freelance designer, fitting my career into the cracks of his schedule so I could ensure his world was always polished. At 42, David is a man of sharp angles and persuasive silences, the kind of man people call a winner. To our neighbors, we were the perfect portrait of stability. They didn't see the coldness that had settled into the marrow of our house. By 8:30 p.m., the celebration I had built started to wilt. The lamb grew cold, and the champagne bubbles died in their glasses. I texted, then I called. My voice was met only by a digital recording. It wasn't until 10:15 p.m. that the front door finally clicked open. David didn't look at the lilies or the emerald dress. He walked to the table and placed a heavy leather-bound folder directly onto my dinner plate, covering the food I had made with his bare hands. "I found the life I was supposed to have, May," he said, his voice as clinical as a balance sheet. "And it starts tomorrow. Without you." The heavy silence that followed David's departure was more deafening than the words he had used to end our life together. I sat at the table for a long time, the emerald silk of my dress feeling like a cold second skin. The scent of the lilies, once sweet and hopeful, now turned cloying and funereal. Eventually, my legs moved on instinct, carrying me up the stairs toward the bedroom we had shared for a decade. I needed to see him. Not the man who had just stood in our dining room like a stranger, but the version of him that still existed in the quiet corners of our home. I pushed the master bedroom door open, expecting to see his leather shoes kicked off near the armchair or his watch resting on the nightstand. Instead, the room felt hollow, as if the air itself had been sucked out. I walked toward his walk-in closet and pulled the handle. The door swung open to reveal a ghost. One side of the closet, my side, was still packed with the colorful fabrics of a life lived in the margins. But the other side was a barren wasteland of empty wooden hangers. The custom-tailored suits, the crisp white shirts I had hand-pressed only 2 days ago, the rows of Italian leather loafers. All of it was gone. Even the faint scent of his cedarwood cologne was dissipating, replaced by the sterile smell of bare shelves. A sudden sharp sound from outside drew me to the window. I pulled back the curtain, my breath fogging the glass. There, idling 2 blocks away under the dim glow of a street lamp, was a large white moving truck. 2 men in dark uniforms were closing the back gate with a metallic clang that echoed through the empty street. They weren't moving him in. They had already moved him out. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a spontaneous decision fueled by a midlife crisis or a heated argument. This was a tactical withdrawal. He had been slowly siphoning his life out of ours while I was busy braising lamb and buying vintage champagne. He had waited until the very last box was loaded, until his new life was literally idling around the corner, before he bothered to tell me it had begun. I looked back at the empty hangers, their bare metal hooks gleaming mockingly in the light. He hadn't just left. He had erased himself. As the truck's taillights faded into the night, heading toward a city I didn't know and a woman I hadn't met, I realized that the man I had been fixing for 10 years had never actually been there at all. He had just been a guest in a house I built, waiting for a better reservation to open up. The following week, the silence of the house was broken not by a return, but by a summons. David requested a meeting at a neutral, glass-walled cafe downtown, a place where the sunlight was too bright and the coffee too bitter. I arrived wearing a coat that felt like armor, but the moment I saw him, I realized he had already moved into a different season. He looked younger, or perhaps just unburdened, sitting there in a suit I didn't recognize, his wedding band already replaced by a heavy signet ring. He didn't waste time with the polite fictions of a decade-long partnership. He didn't ask how I was holding up in the empty house or if I had finished the lamb he'd left on my plate. Instead, he spoke of Chloe. He spoke of her as if she were a prize he had finally earned after years of settling for a participation trophy. "You have to understand, May," he said, leaning across the table with a terrifyingly sincere intensity. "Chloe is different. Is elevated. She moves in circles I only used to dream about. She doesn't just support my career, she accelerates it. She is the woman I always deserved." The words "always deserved" felt like a serrated edge. They implied that our 10 years together, the late nights I spent proofreading his proposals, the sacrifices I made to keep our life seamless, the way I had quieted my own voice to amplify his, were nothing more than a debt he had been forced to pay until he could afford something better. He pulled out his phone and slid it across the marble tabletop. The screen showed a woman who looked like she had been rendered by an artist obsessed with symmetry. Chloe had high, sharp cheekbones, hair the color of spun platinum, and eyes that held the cool, distant gaze of someone who had never known a day of struggle. She was draped in cream-colored silk, standing on a balcony that overlooked a skyline I didn't recognize. "She's a natural," David whispered, his eyes lingering on the image with a hunger I hadn't seen in years. "She has this high society elegance that just fits. Being with her makes me feel like the version of myself I was always meant to be. I'm not saying you weren't enough, May. I'm just saying she's the upgrade I didn't know I could have." As I stared at the glowing screen, a hollow ache opened up in my chest. I looked at my own hands that were calloused from real work, hands that had built the foundation he was now standing on to reach for her. I began to wonder if I had spent 10 years being a fixer for a man who viewed me as a starter home, something to be lived in and discarded once the real estate grew more valuable. His narrative was clear. I was the past, a comfortable but unremarkable draft. Chloe was the final, polished masterpiece. I left the cafe feeling less like a person and more like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that had been deemed obsolete. The digital erasure began at midnight, a surgical removal of my existence that felt more violent than the packing of the truck. I sat in the dark of our living room, the blue light of my phone illuminating a face I hardly recognized as my own. I didn't want to look, but curiosity is a cruel master when your heart has been hollowed out. I pulled up David's profile, and for a moment, the screen froze as if the internet itself was hesitant to show me the carnage. Then the refresh happened. One by one, the tiles of our life together vanished. The photo of us at the Grand Canyon, wind-whipped and laughing. The shot of our 5th anniversary dinner where he'd promised we'd grow old in the same house. The candid picture of me working at my desk that he'd captioned, "My Quiet Strength." They were being deleted in real time. It was like watching a memory bank undergo a lobotomy. 10 years of anniversaries, holidays, and small mundane triumphs were being sucked into a digital void, replaced by a vacuum of white space. By the time the scrolling stopped, I was gone. I had been edited out of his history as if I were a smudge on a lens. In my place, a new aesthetic emerged, one dominated by high-contrast whites, minimalist architecture, and Chloe. The first new post was a curated shot of their joined hands, a heavy diamond catching the light in a way that felt like a deliberate jab. The caption was short, clinical, and devastating. "Finally, the life I was meant for. No more compromises." The comments began to pour in from people we had known for a decade. "Stunning," wrote a woman I'd hosted for dinner a dozen times. "You two look like a dream," commented David's business partner. No one asked where I was. No one mentioned the decade of compromise I had spent building the very platform David was now using to launch his new debut. I realized then that David wasn't just moving on. He was rebranding. To him, our marriage wasn't a sacred bond. It was an early phase that had served its purpose and was now being archived to make the current product look more exclusive. I felt a chill that no blanket could cure. I wasn't just a divorcee. I was a ghost in a machine, haunting a profile that had no room for the messy, beautiful reality of a woman who had loved him without a filter. As I finally closed the app, the silence of the house felt absolute. I was officially a secret, buried under the weight of a platinum blonde aesthetic. The obsession with the upgrade had begun to feel like a fever dream until the afternoon the fever broke. I was sitting in my makeshift studio, the walls stripped of David's minimalist preferences, working on a brand identity for a new client. My phone buzzed with a notification from a mutual acquaintance's public story, a candid, shaky video from a rooftop mixer in Chicago. It was a fleeting moment, a burst of laughter captured in the background of a group shot, but it hit me with the force of a physical collision. In the corner of the frame stood Chloe. The sun was setting, hitting her face at an unforgiving low angle that bypassed the soft focus filters she usually commanded. She was laughing, her head tilted back, and for a split second the polished high society mask slipped. The sharp, aristocratic nose and the flawless jawline remained, but the light caught a very specific crescent-shaped scar tucked just behind her earlobe, and a faint asymmetrical tilt to her smile that no amount of filler could fully erase. The air left my lungs. My mind raced back 15 years to a windowless tutoring center at the university. I saw a girl named Elena Vance. Elena hadn't been an heiress. She had been a struggling business student with a sharp tongue and an even sharper instinct for shortcuts. She was the woman who had disappeared overnight during our senior year after a university-wide scandal involving forged transcripts and a high-stakes embezzlement scheme at a local nonprofit. Elena had vanished before the police could even question her, leaving behind a trail of debt and a dozen betrayed friends. I froze the frame, zooming in until the pixels blurred into a mosaic of skin and light. The bone structure was the same, the predatory intensity in the eyes was identical, but the canvas had been expensive. Elena had been plain, almost invisible, but Chloe was a masterpiece of reconstruction. The truth hit me with a cold, sharp clarity. David hadn't married a dream. He had married a fabrication. He had traded a decade of my honesty for a woman whose entire existence was a calculated fraud designed to hunt for men exactly like him, men obsessed with the aesthetic of success. The natural elegance David had praised was a surgical lie. The aristocratic lineage was a ghost story. I leaned back in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. For weeks, I had questioned my own worth, measuring myself against a woman who didn't actually exist. I wasn't the ghost in this story, she was. And as I stared at the blurred image of the woman who had stolen my life, I realized that the perfect world David had built was resting on a foundation of sand that was already beginning to shift. I poured the discovery of Chloe's past into a small, locked compartment of my mind and turned my focus toward the one thing that had never lied to me: my work. For years, my talent had been a secondary character in the story of David's life, a tool used to curate his professional image and refine his surroundings. Now, that same talent became my lifeline. I took a small studio space in a refurbished brick warehouse, a place where the air smelled of fresh paint and possibility rather than cedarwood and secrets. I stopped designing for an audience of one and began designing for myself. The transformation was gradual but profound. Without the constant weight of David's critical eye, my creative instincts sharpened. I leaned into bold textures and honest materials, moving away from the sterile minimalism he had favored. My small freelance projects grew into substantial commissions, and the quiet strength he had once patronized became my greatest professional asset. Within 6 months, I was no longer just a ghost in the industry. I was a name being whispered in the right rooms. The turning point came when I landed the contract for the Solstice Gala, the most prestigious event on the city's social calendar. It was a high-stakes commission that required overseeing the interior transformation of the grand ballroom, a space that demanded both elegance and structural integrity. As I stood in the center of that vast, empty room with a blueprint in my hands, I felt a surge of confidence that had nothing to do with a man's approval. I wasn't just fixing a house. I was building a reputation. I spent my nights drafting and my days coordinating with vendors, my hands constantly busy, my mind finally still. Every decision I made, from the weight of the velvet drapery to the specific warmth of the lighting, was a brick in the wall I was rebuilding around my own life. I was no longer the woman sitting at a cold dinner table waiting for a text that would never come. I was the woman holding the keys to the most important room in the city. One evening, while reviewing the guest list provided by the gala committee, my eyes snagged on two names, Mr. and Mrs. David Sterling. A year ago, seeing those names together would have shattered me. Now, it felt like a tactical opportunity. The gala wasn't just my professional debut. It was the stage where Chloe's fabricated world would meet my reality. I looked at the guest list and then at the frozen frame of Elena Vance still saved on my desktop. I realized that while I had spent months rebuilding my walls with solid stone, Chloe was still living in a house made of glass. And the night of the gala was going to be the first time I threw a stone. The digital world is a graveyard of secrets for those who don't know how to dig, but as a designer, I understood how to look beneath the surface of a beautiful interface. I spent my evenings in the quiet of my warehouse studio, the blue light of my monitor reflecting off the exposed brick walls. I started with the name Chloe Whitmore. It was a perfect name, crisp, upper class, and entirely untraceable before 3 years ago. There were no childhood photos, no high school yearbooks, and no record of the European boarding school she claimed to have attended. I began cross-referencing the dates of Elena Vance's disappearance with the sudden emergence of Chloe Whitmore. The overlap was seamless. Using my background in digital forensics, a skill I'd honed to protect my own design copyrights, I traced a series of shell companies and offshore accounts that had been used to pay for a complete identity package from a high-end boutique firm in Panama. They hadn't just sold her a new face. They had sold her a history. The heiress narrative was a masterpiece of fiction. The Whitmore family she claimed to belong to had indeed existed, but the last of the line had died in a private plane crash a decade ago, leaving a dormant estate and a name ripe for the picking. I found a digitized payroll record from a high-end corporate hospitality firm in Chicago. There, listed under a common alias, was a photo of the pre-surgical Chloe. She hadn't been an invited guest at the fundraisers where she met David. She had been part of the temporary staff, working the coat check and the hors d'oeuvres trays, observing the habits of the wealthy like a predator studying its prey. She had met David while working as a VIP liaison, under a falsified resume. She had tracked his promotion cycles, his marital frustrations, and his obsession with status. Every chance encounter David had described to me as fate had actually been a calculated maneuver. She had positioned herself in his line of sight, wearing a face he would find irresistible and a background he would find prestigious. As I scrolled through the final set of documents, forged bank statements and a lease agreement for a family estate that was actually a short-term luxury rental, the magnitude of the lie felt heavy. David hadn't just been cheated on. He had been targeted. He had discarded 10 years of my genuine devotion for a high-stakes con artist, who viewed him as nothing more than a secure asset. I closed my laptop, the click echoing in the empty studio. The paper trail was complete. Chloe wasn't a dream woman. She was a meticulously curated project, and her biggest investor was about to find out that his portfolio was worthless. The Solstice Gala arrived with a shimmering, cold brilliance that matched the state of my heart. As the lead designer, I was the first to arrive, watching as the grand ballroom transformed into the sanctuary I had envisioned. Every detail was a reflection of my new autonomy. The deep charcoal drapes, the warm amber glow of the Edison bulbs, and the absolute absence of the sterile minimalism David had once forced upon me. I stood on the mezzanine, clad in the same emerald silk dress from that disastrous dinner, looking down at the stage I had set. Tonight, the decor wasn't just aesthetic. It was a trap. Ensuring the collision was effortless. During my research into the Vance family, I had found Elena's parents. Honest, hard-working people who had been left to pay off the debts of their daughter's scandal, while she reinvented herself as a Whitmore. They lived in a modest suburb 3 hours away, still reeling from the shame of a daughter who had erased them. I didn't reach out with malice. I reached out with a sponsorship for the gala's community recognition segment, providing them with tickets and a car, under the guise of honoring long-standing residents of the state. They had no idea their daughter would be there. They only knew they were finally being seen. By 9 p.m., the room was a sea of tuxedos and floor-length gowns. I saw David before I saw her. He looked every bit the executive vice president. His chest puffed out, holding a glass of scotch like a scepter. And then there was Chloe. She was draped in a silver gown that looked like liquid moonlight. Her platinum hair styled in an intricate regal updo. She moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a queen, accepting compliments on a pedigree she had stolen. David watched her with a nauseating pride, clearly believing he had finally secured the upgrade that defined his worth. I signaled the floor manager. It was time for the community honorees to be seated in the VIP section, directly adjacent to the Sterling table. As I watched from the shadows of the mezzanine, I saw the elder Vances, Mr. Vance in a slightly ill-fitting suit and Mrs. Vance clutching a vintage beaded purse, being led toward their seats. They walked with a hesitant dignity, completely out of place in this world of manufactured perfection. Chloe was mid-laugh, her head tilted back in that familiar predatory arc, when her gaze drifted toward the couple approaching the next table. The transformation was instantaneous. The silver-clad heiress froze, her glass tilting precariously in her hand. The practiced high society smile didn't just fade. It disintegrated, revealing the raw, terrified features of Elena Vance. Across the small gap between the tables, her mother stopped dead, her eyes widening in a mixture of disbelief and heartbreaking recognition. The ultimate audit had begun. The paper trail had been cold, but the sight of the mother she had abandoned was a living, breathing proof that no amount of surgery could ever erase. The silence that rippled out from the VIP section was more profound than any applause I had ever heard. I descended the mezzanine stairs, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic pulse against the marble, arriving just as the glass in Chloe's hand finally slipped. It shattered against the floor, a spray of crystal shards mirroring the disintegration of the woman standing above them. "Elena!" Mrs. Vance's voice was thin, trembling with a decade of grief. It wasn't loud, but in the curated hush of the ballroom, it carried like a gunshot. "Elena, is that really you?" David turned, his brow furrowed in a look of annoyed confusion. He looked at the modest woman in the dated gown and then back at his wife, expecting her to dismiss the intrusion with her usual aristocratic disdain. But the Chloe he knew, the poised, untouchable heiress, had vanished. In her place stood a woman whose breathing had become shallow and ragged. The aristocratic accent she had meticulously practiced for years simply evaporated. "Mom, please," Chloe hissed, the flat Midwestern vowels of her youth cutting through the high society air like a blade. "Not here. Not now." The room exhaled a collective gasp. David's hand dropped from Chloe's waist as if she had suddenly turned to ice. "Mom," he repeated, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. He looked at the elder Vances, then at the silver-clad stranger beside him. "Chloe, what is this? Who are these people?" "We're her parents, sir," Mr. Vance said, his voice gaining a weary strength. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. "We haven't seen our daughter since she left us with the bills from the university scandal. We thought she was... Well, we didn't know what she was." I stepped into the light of the amber bulbs, the emerald silk of my dress shimmering. David's eyes snapped to mine, and for the first time in a year, I saw him truly see me. He saw the woman he had called not enough standing in a room she had built, while his dream was exposed as a hollowed-out fraud. "She isn't an heiress, David," I said softly, my voice steady and devoid of the bitterness that had once consumed me. "And her name isn't Chloe. You didn't find a new life. You found a high-stakes performance." The elite circle, the business partners, the donors, the people David so desperately wanted to impress, began to pull back, creating a physical void around the couple. The perfect aesthetic had been breached by the one thing it couldn't survive: the truth. David looked at Chloe, really looked at her, seeing the surgical scars I had noted and the predatory desperation in her eyes that no amount of money could hide. He looked like a man who had sold his soul for a masterpiece, only to realize he'd bought a forgery. He had traded a diamond for a piece of polished glass, and now, in the unforgiving light of the ballroom, the glass was nothing but dust. The aftermath of the gala was not a grand explosion, but a quiet, rhythmic settling of dust. In the weeks that followed, the city's social columns were filled with the spectacular collapse of David's perfect life, the annulment, the corporate investigations into his wife's background, and the slow, agonizing erosion of his reputation. He tried to call me once, his voice sounding thin and hollow, filled with the desperate hope that I was still the fixer who would mend the pieces of his shattered vanity. I didn't answer. Some things are too broken to be repaired, and some people are only worth fixing when you have forgotten how to value yourself. A month later, I sat in the kitchen of my new home in Boulder. It wasn't a townhome designed to impress business partners, or a minimalist gallery meant to satisfy a man's ego. It was a space filled with the things I actually loved: mismatched ceramic mugs, a velvet sofa in a shade of deep moss, and walls covered in sketches that were no longer preliminary drafts for someone else's approval. The air didn't smell like expensive cedarwood or clinical success. It smelled like roasted garlic, fresh basil, and the cold, clean scent of the mountains just outside my window. I sat at a small, reclaimed wood table, a single plate of pasta before me. I hadn't spent 4 hours braising lamb or obsessing over the arrangement of the silverware. I had cooked for the simple, honest pleasure of feeding myself. As I took the first bite, I realized that the hollow ache that had defined my life for a decade had finally vanished. It had been replaced by a solid, grounded sense of autonomy. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. I was 37 years old, and for the first time I didn't feel like a shadow or an upgrade. I was the original version. I thought about Chloe or Elena, and the exhausting high-stakes theater she was still likely performing somewhere else, under a new name and a new face. I thought about David, forever chasing a dream woman, who was really just a mirror for his own insecurities. I was no longer interested in being a masterpiece for an audience. I was interested in being the artist of my own days. I finished my meal in the comfortable silence of a home that was finally, unequivocally mine. There were no lights to string up for a man who wouldn't show, and no folders to be placed on my plate. Just the quiet triumph of a life built on truth, and the knowledge that the most beautiful thing I had ever designed was my own freedom. Please subscribe and like.